background, she's a professor of literacy education at UConn, and she's written more than 50 articles. She's the author editor of 7 books. She's also the editor in chief of Reading Teacher. Be watching the Facebook page. Good things are coming, from what I hear. And she's a former teacher and reading specialist with a wide range of research interests. And tonight she's going to talk about one of her interests, which are state literacy policies. So Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. We're glad you're here.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. I want to thank everybody for coming and wish you all a happy 2025. I was really glad to get the invitation from Tracy, so I want to thank her and her ILEC team for putting this together and inviting me. Excited to get to talk with you today about some things that I've been thinking about. This is a area of research that I've been thinking about for 3 or 4 years, maybe a little bit longer, and it just kind of builds. So there are probably going to be pieces of this that if we've been together before, and I recognize a lot of the names in the chat, so we've been together before, pieces of it are going to be familiar, and it just kind of keeps building. So stick with me. And thank you again for coming. So here we go. Play the music in your mind that you play when people are getting their Zoom thingies ready. In your mind. Just kidding.
Oh, come on.
Thank you, Tracy. I think that was whoever. Thank you for the sound effectors. All right, here's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about how like the policy making these days is sort of speculative in that sense of speculative fiction, or like speculators going to find gold and taking enormous risks without really knowing what's going to happen, or well, knowing exactly what probably will happen, but taking enormous risks anyway. And I've been thinking about that because when I look backwards, there's this steady progression of increasing constraint. Things are shrinking and tightening. What used to be broad requirements became kind of menus of options in the last 10 years, and now are prescribed mandates and with increasing prescription. So if you lived in one of those places, and this I'm thinking about in terms of US policy, but I'm going to show you in a few minutes that the same pattern, the same narrative, the same storyline, and then literally kind of the same progression of events happens or happened in every other English-speaking country where reading is taught in English for the first time that I've been tracking. So forgive the US centricness, or don't forgive it. It's unforgivable. But also I think you'll notice the resonance because it's the same. This sort of constraint idea is basically what happens when an ultra-conservative policy masquerades as a progressive idea, and therefore gets kind of the interest convergence of folks that don't tend to agree on things to start agreeing on things enough that they pass and get votes. So I like to think about, people talk about the 5 pillars of the National Reading Panel. I want to start calling them the 20th century National Reading Panel, because one thing that I've been thinking lots about related to the National Reading Panel is that the work that was done for it was done in the late 90s. So if you think about like what the internet was like in the late 90s and what research looked like and felt like and consisted of in the late 90s, you can imagine how much constraining that group of people had to do, that panel had to do, in order to get their job done, which they did late. They were given a year, it took them over 2. Their first order of business was to cut out as much research as possible so that they could do something that felt comprehensive, but was still actually doable by a small group of volunteers who were doing this in addition to their full-time jobs. When we were still using things like index cards and card catalogs and hard copies of journals. Like the internet existed, but it was really different. So if you can imagine what a national reading panel would look like today, we have a too muchness problem now in terms of information that's available and studies that you might want to synthesize. And at that point, they also had a too muchness problem, but a not enoughness problem in terms of the ease of sending things back and forth, the ease of accessing everything that might have been relevant. So even though we have this 20th century document, more than 20 years old, from like back in the day when we had dial-up, Um, it's baked into the policies that are written today. So we can think that the science of reading is in one universe, science of reading refers to all of the research on reading. But in the policy universe, science of reading really refers to the National Reading Panel, the 20th century National Reading Panel, five sort of categories that they decided to look into. And one of the big kind of elisions that we've made popularly about the National Reading Panel's five categories or pillars is that they were the most important or the only. And those were really just the categories that they um, could get the right amount of information together about in the time that they had. So they weren't trying to be comprehensive. They weren't trying to be the only, they were just the areas that they could agree upon and find enough, but not too much information for them to do a reasonable review. And yet we're stuck with them written in to all of the laws that all of the states, the 43 of them that have a science of reading policy, you can find the echoes of the National Reading Panel's list right in there. And we know it's the NRP because it's the same vocabulary in the same order. Even when you see that it's interrupted, that list is interrupted by a few other things in some states or others, because something has happened in the last 25 years. The interruption isn't significant, and this is kind of the common thread across all of the policies. If you download and read them, you can see the imprint like a fossil hanging out there. In the US and in other places, state policy has been focused on these four things over time. So in the beginning, we started just with like the idea that you should screen and monitor and have at that point it was scientific research-based instruction. Now it's science of reading-based instruction. And in the middle, you might have had brain-based or evidence-based or whatever else you want kind of based instruction. There always is something about professional development because there's the idea that teachers have something to do with this, but it's a pretty opaque, like one-dimensional idea that teachers have something to do with this. They generally like need a different input. Like we need different training, different professional development, not a different kind of training or a different kind of professional development, just other information put in. So again, really thinking about this 20th century idea of like a floppy disk, put it in there and then we'll have a different outcome, plug and chug. At the moment, we still have these four things represented in the pattern of state policy, which is pretty similar to the pattern of other of sort of provincial policies and other areas. But the options are shrinking. So if you were in a state that had a few options for screening and monitoring assessments in play over the last 10 years after the wave of dyslexia policies, if you had a list of 10 or 15, your list is probably more like three to eight. If you had a list of five, your list is probably more like one or two. If you had 30, you might have 10. So depending on where you were locally, things are shrinking for everybody, but that means something different everywhere you are. So this feels different. I want to acknowledge that for folks that in some schools and school communities, this shift is more abstract. And in some school communities, the shift is like a really tight clamp on what they can and can't do. Some states are using a single curriculum. Some places are requiring teacher preparation to include the same module for everybody. So there's kind of a little bit of a range here. Now, if these things are going to be our policy levers for creating change or reform in reading education, then the problem is we have to use a lot of speculation in order to make these things happen. We've had a lot of conversation from leaders in this area, like David Pearson with Rob Tierney in their latest thing. And one of the quotes from a recent presentation that David gave based on his report with Rob was that we should make sure that we're not, putting the cart before the horse and getting ahead of ourselves in terms of what we know and can prove. And like, that's a really nice idea, except that it already happened. So these are the assumptions, color coded for your viewing pleasure, as I understand them. If we are going to use these policy levers to change reading, which 43 plus states are doing at the moment, and several other countries have been doing or are about to do, depending on who you are. These are the assumptions that are required of us right now. We have to assume that if we're going to use screening and monitoring assessments, if we're going to legislate screening and monitoring assessments, that there are some that are valid and reliable, and some are more appropriate than others. And that's why states should choose them and not let districts or schools or individual teachers do the developing or selecting of these assessments. If you've been in the education profession long enough, you probably have worked in a setting where you have developed your own screening assessments and monitoring assessments. You've probably worked in a setting where you've used one developed by a team of people you knew, or bought from an outside source and probably changed from one source to another, to another, to another. So you understand that there can be quite a big range of what we use in terms of screening and monitoring assessments. But at the moment, when they are legislated in an increasingly constricted way, we have to assume that that constriction, that limitation of choices is related to some idea that there are good options out there that are complete and that some are better than others. This is an assumption because obviously I'm going to show you how it's not true. But anyway, so number two, same thing, high quality curriculum options. We have to assume that those exist. There is such a thing as high quality curriculum, and that people know what that is, and agree on what that is. If the state's going to legislate it, it has to be a thing. So we've got to assume that it is a thing, and then, find the thing, make the list, require districts to choose from the list. This has become a problem in lots of places. Similarly, we have to assume that professional development is based on the science of reading, and that translates in state policy, not in the world, but in state policy, that translates into PD focused on foundational skills for K-5 teachers. In some states K-3, but in many K-5. We have to assume that that information is necessary for them to teach better. We have to assume they don't already know it. And we have to assume that knowing it would be enough to do something different, that they'd be allowed to, they'd be unconstrained in their use of that knowledge. And then finally, we have to assume that pre-service teacher preparation is A, a problem, and B, a solution. And I'm not sure it's either one, but given that sometimes there are deans in the room when I talk about this, that's all I'll say at the moment until I have some data on the slides. I just want to give you like a quick example from Michigan, and I don't mean to pick on Michigan. I was just there kind of recently, and they are in the process, like they're just about to sign this bill into law, or have, or I don't know. But this is like a very recent development for them, so it's fresh. In Michigan, they have written this law that says a screening assessment has to include all of these really interesting, important things. And that would be really interesting and important if there were a set of validated screening assessments that existed for people to choose from, so that the law didn't just require every single district to give their contracts to a certain vendor and not develop their own, and not choose from any other, have no competition at all. But the problem with this list, although it makes sense to me, like if you think about these things, it seems like these might be things that you might be interested in if you were interested in screening for example, dyslexia. That's why there's so much emphasis on letters and sounds here. But it turns out there's really only one existing assessment that has all those. So we have basically two options if we live in the state of Michigan. One, early bird. Raise your hand if you've heard of it. I don't want to pick on early bird because it's a relatively new assessment. It was developed by a team of researchers. It was developed as part of a team that is interested in screening for early identification of dyslexia in particular, not reading disability in general or reading difficulty in general, just dyslexia in particular. And so it has this focus on a set of things that Michigan is also really keyed into, but no other assessment has every single one of those. And no other assessment has the same things at all of the grade levels that were required to give those assessments. So if you're in Michigan, you either have to buy early bird or you've got to fudge it. And because you've got to fudge it right off the bat, all kinds of goofiness can happen at every level. Goofiness can happen at the State Department of Ed. Goofiness can happen at the in your local district offices. Goofiness can happen from vendors. Goofiness can happen in terms of adding and putting together different products. Goofiness can happen in terms of like, well, I can't really fulfill the law anyway, so let's just kind of like do whatever we've been doing. Goofiness can happen. I'm using the word goofy on purpose because it's not necessarily bad. It's just not as cut and dry and simple as it seems like it might be when the state controls or seeks to control this decision about screeners. We know what happens when people have a choice here. They end up like lemmings. They choose pretty much the same thing over and over again. So I looked at the lists of approved screening assessments across all of the states that have approved lists. And the ones that show up the most often are the ones that have been around for the longest, actually. And if we look just at kind of the top five, you see that AimsWeb is way up there. Acadience is Dibbles. It's the same assessment. Dibbles 8 was sold to a company that could distribute it. And Acadience is the spinoff from the original developers. And so it essentially is, you could think about it as Dibbles 9. It's their new edition of the test that they sold. So this really is sort of the same kind of theory of action in terms of what is important to measure, how should we measure it, what biases are we willing to put up with, what level of accuracy are we willing to put up with, how much error can we play with. All of those things are basically answered by the same group of people in the case of Acadians and the case of Dibbles or M class. And then you see Fastbridge and AimsWeb are way up there. iReady is way up there. And there are literally 30 or 40 other options, but these are the one, none, all of those 30 or 40 other options are chosen less than a quarter of the time. So even in places where you have a huge set of options, Dibbles is kind of still here from 2001 and still hegemonic. Now, whenever we choose something like a universal screener, like you might be wondering why I'm wasting your Tuesday night thinking about universal screeners, they take 1 minute, they only cost $1. It's not that big a deal. But like if we change a piece of assessment, it does something. It has this domino effect on all of the other pillars of infrastructure because they're always connected. And so if we change the screening assessment, we change who is sorted and categorized into what groups and why. We change what skills are highlighted and focused on. We change how we define kids that struggle from kids that don't. We change the language that we use when we talk about the kids. And then that ends up having an impact not only on who learns what, but what curriculum is used, what conversation happens in professional development or data teams or PLCs, how leaders are involved in making those decisions. So assessment ends up influencing a tremendous amount of what happens in a school day, and particularly screening assessments that are universal, end up having a really outsized impact for a small thing. I looked to see when people buy these or are required by their states now to buy a specific commercially available universal screener, what else is being advertised at the same time. So what you're seeing in the chart is just if you Google and go to the web landing page of the screener where you can buy it, what else is advertised on that same page, no clicks away. And this is what you're seeing. In many cases, as you can imagine, the screener is advertised with other tools in that data system. So sometimes that means like a math screener, an SEL screener. Sometimes it's advertised with curriculum created by the same folks. Sometimes it's just on the page with ads that are advertising other products by the same publisher that aren't super related, but still they get kind of like packaged all together, and it makes it quite simple. There is an incentive to buy these things as a package and to change not just what are we measuring and how for reading, but also for math, and not just for first grade, but also for third and for coherence. And so we can have longitudinal data systems also for fifth, which means we've got to buy some storage too. Maybe they'll sell us a data system to house our data in. And like if we have this data from K to 5, wouldn't it be great if we could have that same data K to 8 and also K-12, even though those assessments generally are not normed beyond 8, they're only predictively normed beyond 8, so we don't really know, but we're going to give them to high schoolers anyway, because obviously that's an important thing to do. So I went through the technical manuals of all of these tools to see, like, is there a really big difference in quality? Is there a reason that some of them are allowed in some states and some of them are outlawed in other states? And some of them, all of the ones that you see here are allowed in one state or another, but none of them are allowed in every state that has a law. And the thing is, they measure different things. So if we're using them as the universal screen that says whether kids are developing literacy at a rate that we expect or not, we're measuring not only different things, but we're measuring them in different ways. I mean, it really should be all of these things are not like the others. And then when you look through the technical manuals to understand the specifications of these, to understand what the people who develop them have done to make sure that they're valid and reliable, they're not using the same tools to do that. And so we really, there's a nice little white paper from Wested that talks about universal screen comparisons being like not just apples and oranges, but different kinds of apples and different kinds of oranges. And that's probably the best way to think about it. The other thing that I think is interesting is that many of them are using, all of them are using this idea of test retest reliability, which means that they are saying this assessment is a good one because it predicts what you will get on this assessment when you take it again. So we're not deciding that the universal screens are telling us something super important about reading. We're deciding that the universal screens have told us something super important about what score you're likely to get if you take it again and next year and next year. And some of them are also predicting things that matter to other accountability efforts, like they're good at predicting what you will get when you take the PSAT and the SAT. Well, that is something, but it also isn't reading. So we've bought into this idea, the assumption, we've speculated that if we use these universal assessments, we'll be able to identify the kids that need more help and less help and figure out what kind of help they need, and we'll be able to target and move on. And that's the whole idea behind data-driven decision making in education. But that's not actually what we have in any of these cases. Similarly, figuring out if we think it's a valid measure of anything interesting means we've got to think through it different ways for different tests, which partly makes sense because the tests are designed differently. They are different kinds of tests on many of these lists. The other thing that I think is interesting and probably worth looking for, only in the technical manual of the tool that you're actually using in your local setting, you don't need to read all of them like I did. You don't like that's a level of nerddom that isn't required of anybody. However, what is interesting is that if you are using a test with subtests, the reliability and the validity varies across the different subtests. So you can see something like oral reading fluency has a pretty big range here. In terms of like how well the accuracy does on retest reliability. But if it's just oral reading fluency, the number of words, it's actually pretty strong. If we think about things that are a little bit more complex, like the maze, which isn't even given in KN1, we've got a pretty big range that we're looking at. So if you care about things like reliability and validity, it's worth looking at how the individual subtests do, and it's also worth looking at it across the different grade levels before you let it make an important decision about a child that changes something about their day, like which group they're in, or whether they get intervention or not. So we're supposed to assume that there are lots of reliable, valid options out there, but some are better than others. No. Assessment influences intervention, of course. And part of the way it does that is that it classifies kids for us. I just want you to see some of the names that these assessments give us for children based on the scores that they generate about children. And you can see how in one school or state, you might be well below benchmark or low or well below goal, or you could be a 350. And I'm not sure what any of those things really mean. They only mean something in the context of their assessment. And that's another reason that the assessment ends up driving what interventions are chosen, what programs are bought, and similarly, what curriculum is used. We also have this thing with assessment choices is that they end up influencing PD choices because every time you buy a new assessment, you have to be trained on it. And like PD is actually finite, PD time. There's only a certain number of days or hours allocated by law. And they get taken up by things all the time that people don't have a lot of control over. Like some of that PD time has to be, I don't know, fluids training and concussion training and the ice bucket challenge, but then also some of it has to be dibbles until next year when you buy FastBridge, until next year when you buy something else. So a lot of the pie that we could be using to develop educators gets eaten up by things like requirements to adopt a new assessment system. On the topic of PD, there are a few things that we know. We know that there are a number of states that before licensing anybody, they require them to take a knowledge test that includes foundational skills. And the dark states that you see here require them to take a knowledge test that NCTQ thinks is an acceptable or strong test of foundational skills. In the grays, there isn't a required license test that NCTQ recognizes, although there still are required licensure tests and they include something about reading. So we know that in a good chunk of the country, we already have taken care of the idea that basic information about foundational skills is part of like the basic teacher knowledge base. Otherwise, they never would have been licensed in the first place. Unfortunately, the policy is requiring us to assume that teachers don't know this stuff and need to go have an online webinar about it for somewhere between 3 and 35 hours, depending on what state you live in. And in some states, that requirement even follows to administrators and to teacher educators and to anybody who is allowed to call themselves a reading researcher. And so we can think about, some of you might be familiar with Scarborough's rope, which Scarborough made in a chapter in a book that nobody has read, but it's a really pretty picture, and so people have used it often. And it was really just designed to show all of the things that come together in skilled reading. It wasn't designed to be used literally, metaphorically, or really metaphorically, not literally. But I like to think of this as sort of like the rope that's being woven out of state reading policy recently. We don't know exactly what's going to come of it. We have some guesses. But we do know that what has already happened is that there is an increase in required trainings, not development. There are fewer testing options and more guaranteed vendor contracts. So where there might have been a lot of different assessments used, including some developed locally or including some developed by individuals, there is much more standardization and uniformity, and it is much more likely for these choices about assessments and curriculum and interventions to be focused on things that are developed by folks that are not currently in schools. Which brings us to this assumption about curriculum. I don't need to do a lot of work, I think, with this group that's listening tonight, or with anybody these days, although about a year and a half ago, this might have been news to somebody. I don't think it's really news to anybody, that there's no such thing as an objective measure of quality with curriculum. Curriculum is a thing. It doesn't have agency. It doesn't do anything. And when we ask people to rate it, they rate it pretty differently. When EdReports first started to gain traction as an online resource for information about curriculum, one of the reasons it gained so much traction so fast is because it was the only one. You couldn't go find 2 or 3 websites that ranked things the way that other product ratings are. I just Googled like best bike helmet for 7-year-old, and there's like 5 or 7 different websites, and then Consumer Reports, which is one that you might have heard of before, and then like Wirecutter, which is one that you might have heard of before, and then like everybody and their mother's blog, which has their top 10 and their person, whatever. And we are used to, as consumers, having all of these options to think about. But with curriculum, there was EdReports, and then there was EdReports. So that was kind of it for a while. And some in the last 18 months, every organization that was unhappy with what EdReports was choosing developed their own. And so I've been looking at these ratings for approved programs, looking at what they care about when they rate. So EdReports, Curate won't look at anything that EdReports hasn't given a green light to. This is the Massachusetts tool. So Curate sort of assumes standards alignment because they take EdReport green lights. That's why these are grouped together. They look at different things. Sorry, I'll show you this in a second. They care about them, with different amounts of emphasis. And depending on who you pick, they just sort of take their pet issue and make a tool out of it. So if you really wanted to have a super comprehensive view of the curriculum options that you had, you could use like the 5 popularly available tools at the moment and take an enormous amount of time to basically come to a conclusion that you could have come to with a really short checklist. But using any one of these, you are going to find that when you look at the list, if you follow this, and I'll share this later, if you look at the list of approved curricula by state, none of them align with any one of these tools. You couldn't have used EdReports to get to any of those. You couldn't have used Curates to get to any of those lists by state. And so the lists by state end up looking capricious. They end up looking like something weird happened. The longer ones look better because it seems like maybe there was a combination or a loosening of some of the criteria, but we can't tr go trace backwards from a approved list to any of the tools that are out there. Um, Partly because some of these tools didn't exist at the time that those lists were being compiled, and partly because we're always combining and meshing different values and um, goals for what we're looking for when we look for assessment. So the idea that there are like some assessments, sorry, curriculum, the idea that there's some that are high quality and some that aren't high quality, it just, no. It just depends on what tool you're using to measure quality. And those were made up to privilege whatever that particular group wanted to value at the moment. The other thing that is weird about the idea of high quality curriculum is that nobody is doing curriculum the way it's written, even if they want to, even if they're told they must, because none of these programs are comprehensive. All of them require that you add some little piece of something. And all of them are designed to be as comprehensive as they can be. So they're designed to hit on as much as possible, and therefore they are what we call bloated. Now, there's a lot of writing about how basals are bloated, but really anything out there is trying to be comprehensive enough that somebody who doesn't know a lot about what they're doing can have a complete lesson. And so they're long if you, especially when you're new to them, and things take a little bit longer when we're new to them. So you probably would want to add some things to into reading, but you've already filled up your 90 minutes. So you're either going to do that and more, which takes away from anything else you might want to teach during the day. I keep hearing in my department meetings that there are other subjects that people teach. It's a rumor. I'm not sure if it's true, but like people tell me about things like math and science sometimes, which I don't really, we have a like music ed group. I don't know what, really? But anyway, some of these would take a lot longer than what's usually allocated for K1, 2, 3. And so if you were going to do the whole thing as written, you would have to take up a huge chunk of the day doing that. And probably you'd still need to add things. In many cases, you're being required to adopt this within a compendium or within a set of other tools so that you can hit all the things that the 20th century reading panel decided were a good idea. So in many cases, we're already editing and selecting. So decisions are being made at the local level, even if the state thinks they chose, or if we think that a policy has required states to make this decision for local schools. What's happening in classrooms is still the result of individual decision making, either to limit what else gets taught or to cut out pieces of the curriculum that was designed for us. So basically, all of our assumptions about what should or that are baked into the this current trend of reading policy in the US and elsewhere are violated by the truth. We don't actually have the assessments that would warrant that kind of a law. We don't have the curricular options and never will that would warrant that kind of a law. We don't have the evidence that teachers need to learn basic stuff about foundational skills that would warrant a requirement for it. We actually have the opposite evidence. So we're doing all of this policymaking on spec, which gives people a lot of room. It gives them room to make up things like an approved stamp for Wisconsin or built on the science of reading, defined by Amplify. Savas will tell you, or Savas, depending on where you're from, will tell you how to check for science of reading best practices. According to who? According to them. This whole idea is really, focused on this notion from the standards movement folks, this old or conservative idea from the early 80s and probably before, that if we would standardize things, they would be better. If we would take decision making out of local control, things would be better. But if you're deciding about things like what texts are read and what is written by students, and if students do any writing during the day, then you're deciding a whole lot more than reading pedagogy. You're also deciding a lot about culture and inclusion, about conversation that happens in a classroom and background knowledge that kids are building. And weirdly, we don't have any evidence that changing the curriculum changes, making curriculum more standards aligned makes it better. In fact, the only evidence that we have about that compared uh, non-standards aligned curriculum with a standards aligned curriculum showed that standards aligned does as well or worse. And part of the reason for that is that people would be more, one of the ideas from the authors in the end of that paper is that people would be more interested in aligning it to the standards than aligning it to the kids in front of them. And that becomes problematic for those kids who are in front of them learning things. It's probably great for the standards, though. The standards really appreciate it. Um, this is the cover of last year's journal for state boards of education. Um, it is all about how they have not yet realized the promise of high quality instructional materials, which are called high quality because somebody said so somewhere. And even though there was supposed to be a quote unquote renaissance of high quality options out there for people to choose from, states and districts are mostly choosing the same thing over and over again, just like they did with screening assessments. And this is across states with mandates what shows up on the list, but you can look at this for any given area or so. For example, New York City has chosen 3 of these, um, even though New York State doesn't have a list yet. Some other states have longer lists, some states have shorter lists. And the weird thing is, people are okay with this because you can make materials the answer to any kind of problem that you want to solve. And this is, I think, where the interest convergence comes from. Like if you're not interested in teachers who are mostly women, mostly white, mostly middle class, if you're not interested in that group of people having much power, then you should totally control the heck out of curriculum. If that's not on like high on your list of things, but you do think that children aren't learning to read, controlling curriculum is one thing that you can do about that. If you think curriculum is too woke or not woke enough, controlling curriculum is a good idea. If you think that schools are just not focused on the right things, then controlling curriculum is a pretty good idea. None of these statements are really related to each other, and no person that's got this at the top of their list of things that they're really interested in advocating for is probably interested in the other ones on this list, but all of these point to materials being an answer, and so that's gotten a whole lot of oomph. In the beginning, which is around the time that most of these policies were written, and many of the policies are copycats of each other, so the original still carries a lot of weight. Quality was just standards alignment, and that's because Ed Reports was the only game in town advertising their own ratings online. Most of the other tools that were available, you could get the tool, but that they didn't publish their own ratings of things. And we basically are just valuing the same things differently and valuing different things. So here are a couple of these are 5 tools that are out there on the internet. You can download them to look at your K to 5 reading curriculum. And for example, knowledge building, or for example, foundational skills is valued really highly by the Reading League. Student Achievement Partners is kind of a little bit interested in it. Ed Reports is equal to Curate because they're the same. If you want to look, I'm going to share this list later on, but you can look at the ones that I reviewed, and these I think are the ones that I see out there in conversation most. They're also they include this one down at the bottom, which is a regional education lab, not an advocacy group like many of the others, or a university. And this is an older one. This is from 2017, but I do see it referenced, and so it's worth kind of putting out there. But if you look across these, we end up finding, as I mentioned before, that they look for different things and they value those things differently. So this is an idea of what the Knowledge Matters curriculum rating review tool looks like. And as you can imagine, they are really interested in knowledge mattering, in background knowledge building. They have this interest here. About 17% of their points are awarded to ease of enacting curriculum, and feasibility or ease of enacting curriculum shows up on a few of the different tools, but it's valued at different levels. This is what Ed Reports is looking at. This is what the Reading League curriculum rating tool looks at. And it's a little bit tough to compare because they don't actually allocate points. They have red flags and blue flags. So if good things are happening, it gets a blue flag, like, hey, this is a good sign. And if it's doing things that they think are bad, then it gets a red flag. And the number of red flags versus the number of blue flags gives you sort of a relative rating for how much you can trust a curriculum package or one curriculum package or another, because they recognize that No package is perfect. And you just want to know kind of where the flaws are, where the red flags are, so that you can address them as they come. So pretty practical there. The culturally responsive curriculum scorecard is a really interesting example because it has probably the strongest research base in terms of citations that are closely connected to the indicators that they have. There is a research base for some of the others, and the Reading League lists a lot of different studies, especially for word recognition and fluency. There are very few around there for something like the writing part and the reading comprehension part. Relatively speaking, many fewer references in those sections. But this one is probably sort of the strongest, most kind of balanced across all of their indicators, having really strong evidence grounded in research, and therefore they're looking at some pretty different things than the indicators that any other group is looking for. So if you think about like the tool itself, what we think makes a good curriculum rating tool, these are some things that show up, but as you can see, there's a lot of white space here, meaning that the Reading League isn't really concerned with standards alignment or grade level alignment. They're concerned primarily with other things. I don't know where that went, but we'll find it some other time. They are really concerned with foundational skills. There's 34 things that are red flags related to foundational skills and 19 blue flags. But for example, I started putting zeros in and I just like ended up giving myself carpal tunnel. So imagine all of the imagine all of the blank squares have big fat zeros in them because they're not interested in the same sort of set of things. So at the moment, the United States of reading instruction, but this is true elsewhere too. At the moment, we've got instruction that is becoming, if it isn't already, it is becoming more uniform in some contexts more than others. So places that are resistant to state mandates tend to be better resourced and more homogenous, and higher performing historically. That gives them some license to push back. And so they're more likely to push back and therefore more likely to resist this homogenization of professional development, of assessment, of curriculum, and of intervention. Folks that are not able to resist this homogenization are moving towards more teacher-centered approaches because curriculum's coming from the outside. That doesn't mean that the curriculum people writing the curriculum have the wrong idea about instruction. It just means that when you write a curriculum remotely, when you write materials remotely, and they are then put on top of a context, they tend to be more teacher-centered because you've got to be telling the teacher how to do the thing instead of the teacher having the students choose the text or discuss what they have discussion that leads to a change in the lesson plan. We're also seeing in all of these tools, because in order to create something that counts as high quality instructional materials that shows up on a state list, you have to own the rights to the materials. You've got to make sure that they fit whatever criteria you have for complexity or for background knowledge or for whatever else. So we're seeing many fewer whole texts and many more excerpts, especially in grade 3 and above. There are some more whole texts when we're talking about K and 1 because the texts were short to begin with. But we're not seeing as many once they're long enough. The other thing that I'm particularly concerned about, just given the nature of writing in humans, is that there's less writing and there's much more structure to the writing that's there. Again, because it's set outside of a school context and for the school, so it's much more prescriptive than it might have been in other cases. A lot more fill in the blanks, a lot more really specific prompting. We have this too muchness problem with the bloated basals, which there's a lot of talk about basals being bad because they have so much stuff in them. And that's not bad. That's just them trying to cover bases and give teachers as many materials as possible. But the as many materials as possible thing is another kind of challenge that then educators have to deal with. And then the other thing that I think we assumed would be better if there were commercial curricula instead of letting schools develop their own or select their own from a huge range of things is that scope and sequences, even within a program, are not well aligned. Now, you can probably find examples where the scope and sequence for phonemic awareness is aligned with phonics, but probably not with word work or vocabulary or reading comprehension. Sometimes that's because the states have decided that you should be buying separate programs for those things, but sometimes even within the same program, there are difficulties, misalignment with scope and sequence across skill areas, even when you buy a package from one source. which means you either are teaching misaligned curricula, or you're monkeying with it, which means local decision making again, without probably the support and the professional development and the collaboration that it takes to do that well. The other thing that I think is interesting, which is true whether we're talking about assessments or curriculum, is that even when people have the choice to choose something different, the big companies that two of which have been around from since the early part of the turn, well, since the turn of this century, the big companies are getting the biggest number of contracts from the biggest districts. So even in a state like Colorado that has 20 plus options, what actually gets chosen is still a pretty small number of really big companies. And that's tighter than even the law made it have to be. My favorite line from this article that came out in the Atlantic that is theoretically about Lucy Calkins, but is really about kind of the science of reading movement and how it moves, is that science of reading now is the new consensus and it's become the new establishment. And so theoretically, it's on the hook for these changes that are prompted and now for performance more generally. But what's interesting, even keeping this in mind, is that the results of experiments in the science of reading policy world are already being the sharing of those results is already being constrained. Part of that constraining is that folks have said what they've been saying all along. I think if we looked in the early days on Twitter about the science of reading movement, one of the most common things people said in some words or others was, no one is saying that. And for a long time, the curriculum renaissance was supposed to be this idea that there was an explosion of new and better materials out there to support teachers. And that hasn't actually materialized into reality in many places because the choices are constrained and because the districts that have the most choice always had the assets and the agency, and the districts with the least choice are being given the least valued or valuable options. So that's where we go with that assumption. One of the interesting things about these tools that are, it's like sort of an invitation for implosion, the tools that are on lists for different states is that people don't like the choices. They're not getting very good press now. And the interesting thing about wit and wisdom in particular is that there have been protests about it, both because it is too woke and also because it is not woke enough. It's super duper white. And also, folks are concerned that it is teaching critical race theory. So, like, they can't get it right, and that's true. None of the options that are on this list are exempt from what I think is going to be the scathing reviews that come as people keep going with them. So I want to think for you a little bit about, I want to think with you, definitely don't want to think for you. I want to think with you a little bit about what it means and why we're in this phase or this space where we're doing all this speculative policy making. We're choosing to do things without knowing that that the options that we think will be there are really there. And it reminds me a lot of like a lot of the things that are marketed on social media. Are this sort of idea, there's sort of two pieces here, this sort of idea that like you're one click away from happiness. Like if you just buy the right curriculum, things will be better. If you just switch universal screeners, things will be better. If you just give your teachers letters training, things will be better. That like there is a thing that you can buy or do and it will fix stuff. And we love that idea in this country at this time. I think we love that idea as people, like that we could just like, put it in your Amazon cart and let it rip. I am seeing a lot of things like this because it's the new year. And so, there are different kinds of trends in what gets advertised and how in the first couple of months, first couple of weeks of the new year. But recently I've been noticing this trend towards somebody claiming science and also claiming that in a short period of time a day, in 30 days, you're going to see what you need to see. And what's cool about this claim is it's easy to blame the consumer for it not working because you're likely not to do it for all 30 days and they know that. So you won't be able to get your money back guarantee. But anyway, I'm seeing a lot of these showing up recently. And it really feeds into the same thing where if you just did this one thing, or if you just did this combination of things, you would have the world that you wanted to have. You would have the body you wanted to have. You'd have the inbox you wanted to have. You have the organization and the focus and the reality that you want to have. Um, if you just make this investment in something that somebody else designed, but it's going to be good for you. And I put it next to this because like this is sort of like the upside and the downside of social media land. That like there are some things about it that are kind of great, but it's not reality. And we live in it so often, so many of us live in it so often that this feels like it's not absurd, even though it totally is. Social media and grind culture and capitalism and the idea that rest isn't any good and that teachers should be grinding in the grindstone in the trenches doing the thing for all hours of the day really just kills our ability to do anything like daydreaming or imagining or dreaming. Forget daydreaming. And because all we can imagine is what we've seen, unless we are free to dream, then all we are imagining as a culture is what we've seen before. So there is a book called No Future, which is basically an indictment of the imagination for communities of people um, who are oppressed. We can't imagine what it might be like to not be oppressed unless we're free to do some dreaming. And I think the really nefarious thing about the way science of reading policies have impacted schools is they have tied teachers' hands behind their backs, especially teachers that are interested in individual differences or that are interested in cultural differences, linguistic differences. Teachers that love their students essentially have less freedom to engage authentically with students because they are doing it through a script, because they are managing significant amounts of curricular change all the time, because they are doing a lot of assessment that doesn't necessarily give them the information they need, but it's taking up class time, their time, PLC time, data team time, all the time. So this constraining of the teaching profession is done in the name of standardizing it so that it's a little bit better, but it ends up making it really hard for teachers to be able to do what they came into the profession to do, or to dream their way out or vision their way out of having their hands tied behind their backs. I really appreciate Paul Thomas's idea that there is a multiverse when it comes to science of reading policy, that like there really are a few different universes of how people talk about the research that is the science of reading very separately from the policy related to science of reading or the media or the marketing. I think that's a really helpful way to think about it. Um, and I think it also contributes to the difficulty in having any conversations about remedies or solutions or improvement to any of the situations that are difficult. Because when people talk about science of reading research, they're having a very different conversation than the science of reading that's portrayed in the media, even when one links to the other. The stakes, the positions, the folks, the ideas are really operating in a different way. So at the moment, there have been a few like common ideas about where remedies might come from for different parts of the multiverse. And I think it's difficult to figure out really what are we trying to remedy? Because when we think about what's challenging and what needs to shift about science of reading research, I'm really thinking about like in terms of perspective and demographics, we need to see significant shifts. But when I'm thinking about science of reading policy, the shifts have nothing to do with that. The shifts have to do with the reinterpretation of what it's possible and advisable for a state to tell schools to do. So remedies, there are some folks that are thinking about or have used the legal system. And I think we will see some because the history of ed policy in the last 15 years has suggested that when state law is this speculative, and the last time I can remember it happening in the education world is with value-added measurement, the courts step in. And the courts won't say this program is good or bad. They'll just say it's not clear enough that we can make a mandate about it. Um, that's what I think is likely to happen. That's my prediction for the future, based on what I've seen happen with a similar set of policy concerns in this area. But I'm not a legal expert. Courts have operated really differently across different education issues, and these issues are being framed very differently in lawsuits that are occurring or are about to be filed. So the legal system may be part of the story where you are, but I don't think it will be the story everywhere. School boards are part of the story in some places. They're part of why things are so constrained to begin with in some places, and they're also sort of the reason that some schools have more freedom than others. So, it does make sense to think carefully about if you have a school board you vote for, to think carefully about who's on it. If school boards are selected or appointed or whatever in your local scenario, they seem to matter, but they can matter both ways. Same thing with unions. The AFT has really gotten on board with the science of reading. And the NEA has been critical of the way that it's rolled out in schools. And so they've really kind of taken different positions. In Australia and New Zealand, in the media that I have been sort of tracking over the last 2.5 years, unions usually step in to say, hey, wait a minute. And that can backfire or it can help. And it really depends on the local context, not even the national context, like the local context, whether union opposition carries a positive outcome or not. Can educators be part of the remedy? I think we can. I think we can because we aren't trying to do it in the entire multiverse at once. We really can do it a classroom or a community at a time. And I think we do it in two ways. One, I think we point out the lie. And these are all like really tight lies. Like materials are inert objects. They don't actually matter that much. And the quality of them might be nice, but it doesn't change things significantly. Materiality, though, does matter. And what I mean by that is having, clean water, clean air, materials for each kid. Those things do matter. And they make significant differences in equity between communities and between age groups and between schools within a district. So the materiality of an education experience totally matters. The particular curriculum that you bought from who, where, when doesn't seem to be the same level of intensity. Teachers also matter, but it's not the fact of a thing that teaches. It's the fact of a human who has a presence that teaches. Like the information we have about how and why teachers matter has to do with their humanness mattering, their demographic, their style of communication, their way of asking questions and giving feedback, not necessarily where they went to school or how many letters trainings they've had, who they are as people. We also have this little bit of confusion around like responsiveness being something that is just one-dimensional. So a computer can be responsive to outputs, like what a kid clicks, what they answer, how many questions they got right. But that's one dimension of teaching and learning. And the kind of responsiveness that matters is more dimensions than that. And I think it comes down to sort of this, how you have to do those like clicky things where you select the picture to like prove you're not a robot so that you can get into a site or whatever. Like children aren't large language models that just need to be programmed. They are already intelligent beings when they come to us, when they're born. But it's the real kind of intelligence. It's not the artificial kind that has to get programmed in a certain particular way in order for them to, I don't know, not glitch and crash. And the sad thing about that is that it would maybe be simpler for people to buy and sell education like a commodity if we were just trying to program artificial intelligence, but we're trying to cultivate existing intelligence, which is a multidimensional task. So we have to point that out once in a while, that like computers won't be enough, but thank you for offering. And then we have to tell the truth about what needs to happen in schools every day. And I don't think there's a huge amount of disagreement about this, but I do think there isn't a lot of noise about it. This might seem like a kind of an awkward pivot in a presentation that's mostly about reading policy. This was mostly about reading policy because there isn't any writing policy, and reading, as usual, is taking up all the oxygen in the room. This t-shirt that I have designed here is a play on a t-shirt that exists and has to do with everybody watching women's sports. But I think it needs to go viral because I think if people read children's writing, then that would mean that kids would have time to do their own writing, which would mean a lot about their literacy block if they got to write every day and people read what they wrote every day. That thing alone would make some shifts and would create space and opportunities for a lot of the things that are getting squished out by the current constraints. We also have to kind of buy a better metaphor. So, like when we think about reading and the science of reading, the metaphor that so often is invoked, or the images that are so often invoked, are about brains that are part of this sort of like processing computer thing. And reading really isn't about like spitting out an answer. It isn't about like plugging in a floppy disk. It's a communication thing. And writing isn't about like producing the right answer or like the right number of things or like spelling stuff. It's about the composition of things. And reading and writing aren't really limited to print, but our obsession with that is rooted in white supremacy. And so I was just thinking like, what's a really great example of like composition that doesn't have anything to do with print? And I can't get this Beyonce Bowl video that's now on Netflix. I can't get it out of my head. I've watched it like 100 times with my kids. So I just had to put a picture of it here because it was the image that kept popping into my mind. So much said, so much created and curated and composed, written onto the field that day. Very few printed words. I think it says Cowboy Carter about 100 times. And then at the end, there's a flag that says bang. So really, we need to be interested and obsessed with kids being invited to compose and to communicate. And if that can happen during the literacy block that is now constrained by the state, then that's awesome. And if it can't, then just do that literacy block as fast as possible so you can get to the work of communication and composition, because some beautiful things can happen when you do that. All right. Um, Dr. Andy Johnson told me the attention spans are pretty close to 60 minutes, and I just talked for 62. So I'm gonna stop talking right now and we'll take some questions.
All right, people, if you want to put your questions either in the question thing or the chat, I will field them so that Rachel can focus on the answers. So if you have questions, put them in the chat or in the question thing. Got some thank yous for you. Why is writing never a focus of legislation or concern, banking model of education, or something else?
A confluence of issues. Banking model of education is part of it. Writing is really expensive to assess, expensive and time consuming to assess. And so it just doesn't appeal to the bean counters in the same way. It will in 5 minutes. I mean, there's already like a Facebook group called the Science of Writing. Like in 5 minutes, they will figure out a way to do this too. But at the moment, there's room here. There's breathing room around writing. So we should capitalize on that because it probably won't be there forever. And um, reciprocity is going to win the day, I think. And it also, asking kids to do this much reading skill work in a day without composition, without having them use what they know from reading to do their own writing, is like asking them to develop literacy with one hand behind their back, because without the opportunity for the reciprocity, it's stunted. So partly as a remedy to the kind of instruction that people are getting from package programs, I think it makes a big difference. And the reason it's not there is because it's really hard to do teacher directed writing, because the point of writing is student direction. It's easy to do teacher directed fill in the blanks or formulaic writing or 5 sentence paragraphs and 5 paragraph essays, but it's difficult to do the kind of writing that qualifies as composition, and especially the kind of writing that isn't only print. With like an outside guide. Like I just think back to like when I was teaching middle school and my teacher's guide for reading was like that, and my teacher's guide for writing was like that. And also prep for teaching writing. Prep isn't huge. What you do while they're writing is really big. But for reading, it was preparing all the time. And then they would read. Do you know? So like it's just a little bit of a flip. And it's a flip in terms of what you need to do to enact the pedagogy. And it's a flip that works in our favor at the moment. But it also works, I think, in kids' favor at the moment because think about the literacy experiences or the interactional experiences, the communicative experiences they're having during the day if they're not allowed to write or if they're not invited to be writers and the difference that it makes. It just seems like a place where we still have room to do the kind of instruction that we want to do, and we've lost so much ground um, in the other areas.
Here's another question. What legitimate evaluations have been done to assess the impact of science of reading approved reading programs after these programs were mandated, not the ones conducted by publishers?
You guys are cute. Um, all right, let's see. There has not been a legitimate, or really any, published research on the impact of the policies. The only thing that I think qualifies is there was a study of, which wasn't a result of state policy, but there was a study of like when you do science of reading aligned curriculum in quotation marks, because that can mean a lot of different things. Really, the study was of bookworms. When you use bookworms, um, and have professional development and have writing and they're able to produce some results. And so that doesn't mean that that's the program for every school ever. It just means that it's one that has been associated with some gains in a study that meets some standards of quality. Um, it wouldn't be so impressive if there were more of them. And it doesn't mean that bookworms is therefore the best and none of the others should be used. It just means there's like a piece of evidence that is the kind of evidence people say they want about the introduction over several years of bookworms. And people are taking that study as a win for knowledge building curriculum, even though knowledge building curricula are pretty widely varied from each other. There are things that claim to be knowledge building, and for science of reading alignment, even though things that claim to be really like bookworms did pretty good in this study. So that's really great. Yay.
Can you give us any reason for hope?
Yeah, you're here. Everybody that's here is a reason for hope. And I think every time I look at student writing, I feel very hopeful, partly because kids are brilliant, and partly because if they are given the opportunity to write, something is right about their literacy development opportunities. Like if they get to write stuff, then something in their literacy block is going well. If they haven't done any writing, something is very wrong. You know, we used to say, when I worked with Dick Allington years ago, we used to say that you could like walk into a room and if they weren't reading, writing, or talking, something was very wrong. And you don't need value-added measurement to tell you that. Um, if they are doing writing, then we can ask what kind and how. But like if there was no writing to begin with, we know there's something really wrong with the literacy block. And what I am seeing close to home and far from home, and what I'm hearing from teachers is that there is less and less requirement of that and therefore less and less room for that.
Rachel, do you have a publication that can be accessed that includes the information shared during this webinar?
Um, yes and no. So it's spread across three, and none of them are out yet. But I'll make sure that I share it with this community when they do come out. Watch this space.
And if you share it with ILEC, I'll make sure all our members get it.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Rachel tonight? If you need a certificate for professional clock hours, send me an email. I'm putting it right there, and I'll be happy to send you one of those. Other than that, let's see. Wonderful thank you from everyone. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, people. This has been wonderful, and thank you very much, Rachel. I'm wearing my hat. People, we have another one coming up, and look for look for my posting of this. So thank you very much. We've had people from all over the world tonight, and it was wonderful. And Rachel, I cannot thank you much for sharing your ideas with us.
Thank you. Great. Glad to be here.
Of change. We will be agents of change. All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, Rachel. Thanks, Andy.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.
You might want to save the chat too if you haven't, as people are leaving.
Oh, yeah. I'll figure that one out.
If not, 3 dots at the end of the bottom of the chat.
Yep.
Plus, because you're the host, it'll pop up for you anyway.
Yep. I'll do that.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was awesome. And if you want to send your PowerPoint or whatever, we'll make sure we attach it with the webinar
Absolutely.
or whatever it is that you have.
I'll download it and share it now.
Yeah. If you want to share your PowerPoints, you decide, we can put it on our ILEC website.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, I will be sending this recording out. I'm going to stop the recording now.